So, Happy New Year to anyone out there who is in touch. In God there is no time and space, and yet they do count when we approach Him, and it's in that ambit that I'd like to approach one or two angles of time and space with regard to our worship. Following again Romano Guardini, the great liturgist, I'd like to look at the question of walking and steps to start off with. Because walking and because steps are part of what we do anyway, we tend, is it not true, to do the same as we always do, even when it comes to the things of God. Well, it's a big error. We don't enter into functional mode when we go into sacred space. Every muscular movement is part of something higher, and therefore it must be done in a slightly different mode. The person who has no liturgical awareness will go at the normal speed from A to B, but he will not have edified, and he will have actually detracted from the calm serenity which should be conveyed by every liturgical movement. Little parenthesis. Some years ago, when there was a question about being transferred to Italy, which actually did happen, one thing which had quite an effect on the decision of being transferred to the foundation in question was a letter from the founding prior, and it contained this in it. Regarding the liturgical life for which that house had been formed, partly, he said this: it gives us, he said in French, une grande sérénité, a great serenity. And that word always remained with me. Serenity is one of the fruits of being bathed in a liturgical atmosphere and life. The chant carries us, the movements bear us up, and so there is a certain difference, otherness, and higher order to things, even physical and muscular, in the work of God. And so I quote here one or two things which he has to say about this. Steps. They are among the simplest exteriors, and yet they carry the greatest mysteries. Steps are an instance of this other dimension. Every one of the innumerable times that we go upstairs, a change is actually happening. Now remember that he is coming from the ambit of gliding, dovetailing into God. The ethos of the approach to God was not a crashing but an ascending, and there was a gestuality about it which carried not only the celebrant and those serving him, but the whole people of God into that progressive encounter with the unutterable and the higher. Now, when one compares what actually happens in the correct approach to God with the way in which quite often on parish level we come into more of the same thing with e.g. good morning, then we have realized what we're not at. We have completely misunderstood that the dialogue, the encounter, is not at that point between men, but between souls and their Maker. And therefore an otherness of greeting comes into it. And what better than what comes to us from the early church? Words already found in Scripture. Now, he goes on. There is something mysterious in the act of ascending. Our intelligence would be puzzled to explain it, but instinctively we feel that it is so. We are made that way. Now, in the way in which somebody formed classically into celebrating is conveyed, there is that element of already, before one comes anywhere near the altar of God a notion of being put apart from where we're coming from. The calm vesting in which one does not at all speak to other people, whoever it may be, at the moment of vesting, but at least interiorly, but classically actually exteriorly, one prays, remembering what each sacred garment means, and then one comes to the actual putting on of the outer layer, the chasuble, which gives one physically a difference of identity. Now, from that point onwards, to do anything which does not pertain to God is to misunderstand the meaning of the garments that we're putting on. And then that whole entry into the house of God is something which can be edifying, elevating, or merely functional. Even on a weekday basis, somebody who has a liturgical awareness will give something of that to his people. The very act of coming in with a simple chant, which is not that difficult to do. Think of the plethora of good, edifying, simple, memorable chants coming from Taizé, for instance, and then one sees what one has at hand. Or very simple verses that most people actually still know, and even new ones coming out of the renewal, are very useful at that point. There's a world of difference between coming in and just crashing into the first written words of the liturgy, and coming in with singing something like, "Father, we adore you, lay our lives before you, how we love you," and that kind of thing, which people can easily pick up and join in with. It creates, in the second case, an atmosphere. And there are plenty of similar verses that one take up. One can use, for instance, something which corresponds to the feast or the season. Now, at Christmastide, what better than "O come all ye faithful," things which people do actually know. And at other times of the year, there are correspondingly useful chants which are actually there in the memory cells, and one doesn't need books. So one, by that, can easily create a preparatory atmosphere. The use of things which can accompany that going into the glorious domain of God and of His angels is something which also is not that difficult to put on, but the fact of putting it on shows that we care. We care for God and what pertains to God. And so when it comes to a celebration like what we will have tomorrow, the Epiphany, what better than the use of incense? It's going back to the three wise men, and also even to pre-Christian cult, for we have taken that from the temple. It's not that difficult, it's still part of the liturgy, and very few people think how simple it is, and yet how moving it is when used properly in conjunction with good chant. The slow, majestic movement of the celebrant and who is with him is something which straightaway takes away the banality of things and places us in the atmosphere of the angels that we are actually joining at the altar. But there again, functionality must be excluded. Every movement must be slow, again serene, majestic and other. There is, I've noticed in one culture more than another, a certain tendency to do things properly in that realm. I've noticed that French people, Africans, Germans have a certain dignity about them when they do these gestures, which some cultures don't easily acquire in the same way. But I was very edified by contact with the French in particular, in the way that slowly, majestically, and in an other way, another mode, not that of every day, they somehow suggest here we're in a different area, a different domain. And the way that we honor God, in the way that we incense the crucifix, again shows that we are not in any way serving ourselves, but coming to honor our King. The way that we honor Him by genuflecting as we come to the sanctuary, bowing before Him, kissing what represents Him, Christ the rock, the altar, and the saints linked with Him, who might be embedded in the altar, the relics. All this indicates love and affection expressed physically. So, when it comes to inviting the people of God into somewhere other, we must be there ourselves first. If, on the other hand, we perform to the gallery, if we start by a banal remark, and worse still, a joke, and provoke a giggle in the congregation, we have immediately destroyed the sacred atmosphere. The opening words of the celebration are not the point to make some kind of homily. The rubrics are quite clear about this. A few lines of introduction may be used, and therefore one thinks in advance what one is going to say at that point. Essentially, it should be a reassuming of the theme of the liturgy or some aspect of it, e.g. the saint that we're celebrating. It's not a homily. It's more difficult, actually, to say something meaningful in a few words than to preach a homily. It needs a lot of thought, and that thought should be prayer-filled, so that there one sees straight away where we're coming from in the sacristy. If that has not been happening, if one has been talking about the football match of the previous day, that too will be felt at the altar. More of the same thing. When we're handling God, we're handling not more of the same thing, but the one who will judge us one day. And we know that a priest will be judged very severely on the way that he's treated his God. We are mystagogues. We bring people, agogain, we bring them into mystery. So I carry on with quoting Guardini on this question of going up. Remember now, in the old rite, the altar was not kissed until the prayers at the foot of the altar had been said. And so there was this absolution already happening before one came close to the altar. One was in profound bowing mode, begging for forgiveness and confessing one's unworthiness to approach. And so there was a physical graduality about approaching God. And then as one ascended, usually 3 steps, there were these prayers being said, and then and only then did one kiss the altar and incense it. Now, for this sense, we have that heaven is up rather than down. We depend on something in us deeper than our reasoning powers. How can God be up or down? The only approach to God is by becoming better morally. And what has spiritual improvement to do with a material action, like going up a pair of stairs? What has pure being to do with a rise in the position of our bodies? There is no explanation, he says. Yet the natural figure of speech for what is morally bad is baseness, and a good and noble action we call a high action. In our minds we make a connection, unintelligible but real, between rising up and the spiritual approach to God. And him we call the All-Highest. I make a jump at this point. This does concern everyone in the assembly. There are points when we actually declare with our body whether we are worshipping someone higher than ourselves or being matey to our chum. The way that we use our body during the Eucharistic prayer, the way that we use our body in particular at Holy Communion and what follows it. These are mute languages, very eloquent and very telling. One is saddened by the quality of some of our communions, and one is saddened by the lack of education given to our first communicants sometimes, when one remembers that they are the Catholics of tomorrow. The first message is very important. My friend, whose church I use on a Sunday, we were students together in Rome, and we were ordained nearly about the same time. I've noticed that when it comes to preparing his children for First Holy Communion, he gives a clear message. The First Communion he obliges them to receive on kneelers. There are 2 kneelers put, they come 2 by 2 for their first communion, and he always gives it for the first one on their tongue. So at least whatever happens in the rest of their life, they've had the message that this is not ordinary bread, and this is God, not man, and only he will give it. It's something which leaves an imprint on the mind and heart and intelligence and soul of the first communicant. A child who sees the ordinary way of giving ordinary bread in his mind is something which actually will impinge on all his future, because the first encounter will be less than that other encounter of the person who's been taught from the beginning that this is quite different from the ordinary, and therefore the extraordinary way of receiving the Lord is something which will have an effect for good or for bad. So let's get this straight. We need to be aware that if it's not happening in the children's ambit in school, it has to happen at home, that they are told quite clearly what they are receiving. Because if one scratches, one finds that a lot of the children are talking about blessed bread, holy bread, and they're not taught actually what is going on. And this is serious, because if they're the Catholics of tomorrow, that means the Church of tomorrow will be without faith in the real presence as we know it. And the word transubstantiation will be quite alien to them. They will not be aware that this is not just a symbol. We're becoming neo-Protestants in our faith. And it would put us to shame if we saw how high Anglicans actually worship what is not there compared with the way that we do not worship what is there. It's important that we be aware that what we cannot see with the eyes is truly there. And the angels weep to see the way that we do not honour our God and our Maker. So this physicity of the way that we come up or come to and almost come down to God matters. If children are being taught to receive in their hands, there can be a damage limitation operation going on there, such as we had in our monastery in Italy. We had hundreds and hundreds of people coming to camp around, young people, scouts especially. It was like a tese in Italy, and therefore we had a great ministry to young people. But this bit we did get through to them. What we used to do was this: it was our policy not to interfere with what was happening in their own parishes and formation, but within the ambit of the monastery we did give this message clearly, and we got the message through the way that we behaved. It was that if they were receiving in the hand, they were invited to present their hand as a great throne presented to the High King in a gesture of beggarliness, utter awareness of what they were doing in a quite different way from the way in which they just be presented for any other object. And we, as we were celebrating and presenting the host to them, and only ourselves, priests and eventual deacons, would present it in a way which made them aware, holding it high above them and pronouncing slowly in Italian the body of Christ, so they were made to be aware they were adoring their king, and therefore there was a clear damage limitation operation going on, using the structure that was there, but using it well. And not only that, but creating an atmosphere around it with good, profound organ music and other instruments in such a way that many people would come up on a Sunday morning in this atmosphere of incense and beauty, and even in the new rite, but would be actually moved to tears, and you could see the tears in their eyes by the beauty. They were exposed to something in the new rite now which was very moving, because it was done with care. Care! Care! And that is the problem. We do not care. It's not a problem of rite, it's the problem, our problem in handling it, because the rite does with it what you do to it. So the steps that lead from the street to the church remind us that in going up into the house of prayer, we are coming nearer to God. The steps from the nave to the choir, that we are entering in before the All-Holy. The steps between the choir and the altar say to whoever ascends them the same words that God spoke to Moses on Mount Horeb: "Put your shoes from off your feet, for the place where you are standing is holy ground. The altar is the threshold of eternity." It is a great idea that if we go up even a common stairway with our minds on what we are doing, we really do leave below the base and trivial, and are in actual fact ascending up on high. Words are not very adequate, but the Christian knows that when he ascends, it is the Lord that ascends. In him the Lord repeats his own ascension. That is what steps mean. We had actually in the Gospel this very day that verse about the angels ascending and descending on the Son of Man. If we only knew how many angels are watching us and waiting. They cannot use the body that they haven't have, but they count on us to do what they would want to do and would do well if they had a body. But they weep if they see our bodies lounging around with folded arms and in a who cares atmosphere to the Lord of Lords and God of Gods. So we'll come back to that in a second. So we'll make another step here. It's the physical step of crossing the frontier. Now, a church is extraterritorial. If one goes to the FAO in Rome, it doesn't belong to Italian government, it belongs to the United Nations, and so there are places which have a different jurisdiction. A consecrated church belongs to the High King and is the court of the angels. We know from the diary of St. Faustina that there was a bright angel guarding every consecrated church. And there where the Blessed Sacrament is, there is a whole throng worshipping quietly in adoration. We were reminded of that actually in the visions of Knock, with those angels going around and round and round for 2 hours around the altar, around the slain lamb. There they are. We cannot see them, but they're there. So this is the domain that we enter when we enter church. And there is a frontier. There's no passport asked, as there would be at the border, but there is a change of level, a change of atmosphere. The word profane comes from 2 roots, pro, in front of, and pharnum, which is the holy place, the temple. So it came then, by extension, to mean the non-holy, the profane. But the pharnum is different. That was already perceived to be such, even in the Latin and Greek culture, which gives us that notion. And by the way, the early Paleo-Christian churches are based on pre-existing architecture. They took the law court system and put the bishop where the judge would be, in the apse. Now, with regard to the church, the door then is the place where we pass the frontier between the profane and the pharnum. Every time that we enter a church, if we but notice it, a question is put to us. Why has a church doors? It seems a foolish question. Entry to go in by. Yes, but doors are not necessary. Only a doorway. An opening with a board partition to close it off would be a cheap and practical convenience of letting people out and in. But the door serves more than a practical use. It is a reminder. Now, several things are going on as we go into that door. One will find a holy water stoup just before or just after, and that is not indifferent. When one takes holy water, one is leaving behind the profane as one enters the pharnum, and so one does wash, one does ask for pardon, one does clear the mind of the clutter that we're carrying with us. Remember the word that St. Bernard of Clairvaux, who was a great preacher and a man of affairs in the church in the 1100s, he would, with all his burdens, be free once he had passed the holy water stoup. He would say to his problems, his worries, "Stay here, I will take you up again when I come out." And so when he was in church, he was with the angels. In conspectu angelorum psalam tibi Deus meus. In the sight of the angels, I will sing to you, O God, my God. When you step through the doorway of a church, you are leaving the outer world behind and entering an inner world. The outside world is a fair place. abounding in life and activity, but also a place with a mingling of the base and ugly. It is a sort of marketplace, crossed and recrossed by all and sundry. Perhaps unholy is not quite the word for it, yet there is something profane about the world. I make a little parenthesis here. The story is told in the Desert Fathers about one monk who had to go from the desert into the town for business on behalf of the monks, and he noticed one demon lounging around calmly, quite happy with himself, because he could see that all these lovely people in the marketplace were doing exactly what he wanted, because he just had to give them a prod and a nudge, and they would instantly obey his temptation. Then the same monk returned to the heart of the desert and saw 40 demons of ferocious kind attacking full pelt a young monk, trying to make him sin by thought, and they were not succeeding. The lesson was that the marketplace is a place where people are unaware, and they couldn't care about their soul. Much happens in the profane. And so, if we come in to the Farnum, the holy place, with all that unsorted and unfiltered, we are bringing all the world into the sanctuary. If then we carry on and make it heard by our words, then we are adding even more to the offence. It's not just our mind, but then our lips too, which are engaging with the demons, and that is bound to take away from the praise of God and the fruit that we will receive from being in his presence. If we've had a good chat in church, we have not met God, we have met ourselves, and we've satisfied the tempter of the soul, who loves to hear a lot of noise in church. Hell is full of noise, and to have a lot of noise in church is to bring not just the world, but elements of hell into the Farnum. God is not honoured by noise. He prefers that serenity of which I spoke in the beginning. In the atmosphere of the angels, there is no room for hustle and bustle. The angels are serene, and we need to hop on and imitate them, not what we're leaving outside the church door. Just on Sunday, I happened to be coming in to church for the confession, which I hear and also make my own, because I have the two things going on at the same time on a Sunday morning early. I noticed something which was quite curious. One of the places where one can bring noisy children is actually now being occupied by noisy parishioners, and because they think they can't be heard, they have an almighty chat therein. That is their preparation for Holy Mass. I thought to myself, that is interesting. What kind of encounter will a soul who has had a merry chat have when God is trying to get through, and all that can be heard is the echoes of a long, profane conversation? And often, if I go to hear confessions, not usually at the early Mass, but sometimes at a later one, if I'm in the box before Holy Mass, they're fairly good actually in our parish, but I have noticed it is coming in, they're talking, some more than others. And I did often think to myself, it's interesting that there's a lot of sin going out there in the air right now, but no one is coming into the box to confess it. There was a lot of grace in that confession box, none was coming for it. And there was a lot of grace coming from the altar, and many were not receiving it as they could, because there was too much of the profane in their mind. Grace is always generous, but the fruit depends on us. If we're full of other things, the Lord can't get a word in edgeways. If we're serene, then there's a calmness of mode which allows the Lord to find resonance. Resonance is what happens when an object vibrates. When lightly vibrated by another frequency, if it finds the frequency that it has naturally, in other words, it has a very, very high vibration when it reaches its own buzz, so too the Holy Spirit makes us have a frequency of resonance if he finds us open and able to be touched. If, on the other hand, he finds a lot of other stuff, his gentle impulses can't find resonance. He has a word for us, he has a grace for us, but we weren't there for it. We were buzzing with other frequencies and we couldn't find his. Well, to bring in conversation into church is a bit more of that. To be aware how much the Lord has to give us, we need to calm down completely and beg humbly for a word as we come to the beginning of Mass. And that's why to come at the last minute is already a very bad preparation. It's important to come and celebrate calmly. That applies to those in the sacristy. It applies also to the people of God. One needs a space. There is one mystic in South America, Colombia I believe, Catalina, who has been shown the graces that we miss at Mass. And this was one thing that she was made to understand. The getting to church in time and calmly had an impact on the quality of reception during the celebration to follow. It is not good enough to rush to church and to be out of breath just as the priest is starting. One needs a physical as well as a mental calm. One is wedded to the other. We are psychosomatic beings, and the calm of the body impinges on the calm of the mind and the soul. People who come, I've noticed, to the hermitage there for the 7 o'clock Mass in the morning are naturally calm because of the hour of day, and they receive many graces. That is my friend the bird. You can probably hear him. I'll let you hear him because he listens and acts when I start him off. He'll calm down. Thank you for that. Yes, he's singing his praise as well. Now, basically, with regard to the element of calm, those who come to an early celebration are also fasting. Those who come also without having had any business in the day are fasting from worry. And that is one thing that impacts hugely on the quality of celebration. The age-old custom of celebrating the sacred mysteries very early and before anything happens the day has had its raison d'être. It has formed many saints, and it does actually work. Because when one is coming with all kinds of concerns and worry, and often because of that at the last minute, then the worry and the concern is what is foremost in the mind, and one is not free mentally and emotionally for what the Lord has prepared for us. And I've noticed that those who come to the hermitage and also stay in prayer for a good while afterwards have the maximum of grace and nourishment for their soul that they could possibly have, because they are going away having let the Lord be minister to their soul, the Lord be the interior master, because there are many graces to be unpacked at Holy Communion and also in the listening to the Word of God, things which don't happen if one talks before and after. And so many graces evaporate into the air when the Lord is truly present in people's souls, when after a celebration they start to talk to each other and not to the guest of their souls. Again, we blame the rite for things that we are guilty of ourselves. The problem is not the rite, the problem is the way we handle it badly. The rite will be handled well by those who love the Lord, as can the old rite be handled badly by those who were too hurried to get to the end. We must remember that everything was not perfect before the changes either, and the big disease was hurry and haste. But it can happen too in the new rite when we don't unpack the grace. Now, between the outer and the inner world are the doors. They are the barriers between the marketplace and the sanctuary, between what belongs to the world at large and what has become consecrated to God. And the door warns the man who opens it to go inside that he must now leave behind the thoughts, wishes, and cares which here are out of place. His curiosity, his vanity, his worldly interests, his secular self. Make yourself clean. The ground you tread is holy ground. Now, there is a problem. It's this. People have not seen each other for a week, and so they think that they have to apply Christian charity in the way that it is normally applied when they're meeting each other. And so they think that it is the correct thing to do to ask how the other person is, and so on, to greet them a happy Christmas and a happy New Year according to the season. It's completely to misunderstand that there we meet not on the profane level, but in God. And we meet God together. We meet each other in God, and that is a quite different way of meeting. And we can lose that grace and privilege by the other coming in at the wrong time. These messages can be given to the parish bit by bit. It makes a huge difference in a parish where these messages are actually given, because people actually do listen, and they do listen to the example given. If the priest himself is into it, the wrong kind of familiarity, then there is a problem, because they think, well, Father does so, so it's all right to do so. It's important that we give only good example. There are ways of doing it without lacking in charity. One doesn't have to engage in a full conversation if one is greeted. One can just greet back calmly, whisperingly, and not engage. The problem comes when we actually go into a full conversation. We're not under the Lord's blessing anymore. Do not rush through the doors. Just take time to open our hearts to their meaning and pause a moment beforehand so as to make our entering in a fully intended and recollected act. There's something very beautiful about coming in procession, a procession in which everyone actually is participating. And there again there's a problem in Ireland, because people leave all the singing to the experts. It's very moving when a whole assembly sings with joy and uses the beauty of the human voice to praise God and also to move together. God then is claiming his own authority over society. The physical enters into it. The doors have something else to say. Notice how, as you cross the threshold, you unconsciously lift your head and your eyes, and how, as you survey the great interior space of the church, there also takes place in you an inward expansion and enlargement. St. Faustina, in one passage in her diary, comments on the way that she was dumbfounded upon entering one very beautiful church, and she was given to understand that that's the way the Lord wanted it to be, that the very church itself should speak to the heart. And there is in our tradition of Catholic architecture something there still. We have beautiful churches, and we have to respect the gift of the architect. In fact, this very morning I had the bishop here, and he was mentioning how some churches in the 60s were too hastily changed, and the vision of the architect was not respected. You can't just do anything you like with a church of great beauty that we have received from the distant past. One has to respect what the architect was trying to say, often under inspiration. They were gifted people. The same applies to modernizing hymns. One should not be dabbling with the inspiration given to a hymn writer in the past, e.g. for inclusive language and political correctness. There is a completeness in a work of art, whether it's architecture, plastic art, or poetry. One respects the genius of the composer and inventor. In our monastery in Italy, we chose not to interfere with what we had received, and so we maintained the one altar that was always there, the high altar, and we also maintained the vision of the architect, because we were celebrating also the risen Christ, the returning King, and so on a weekday we would celebrate facing the rising sun through the east window. It worked perfectly, and we had incense, and only on a Sunday and big feast days would we face the people, but still on the same altar. There was no need to have a different altar. It works perfectly well. In fact, there is a problem with multiplying the altars. It takes away from the symbolical nature of Christ the centre. However, that's not a question itself, church architecture. What is clear is that we had the advantage of going up to a high altar, and it had a huge impact on the soul. One was really going up to a different sector. There was a church nearby. It was actually the Cathedral of Pienza, where sometimes we would celebrate, and they only had the high altar as well as the altars around, but the high altar had never been interfered with, and one still climbed up to the high altar facing the other way. It was very moving. They had not dared to interfere with what the architect had in mind, and it worked perfectly well. One was going to somebody greater than ourselves, up into the atmosphere of the angels, and one took the people with one up to God and not to another part of themselves. Mountains indeed are higher, The wide blue sky outside stretches immeasurably further, but whereas outside space is unconfined and formless, the portion of space set aside for the church has been formed, fashioned, designed at every point with God in view. The long pillared aisles, the width and the solidity of the walls, high arched and vaulted roof, bring home to us that this is God's house and the seat of his hidden presence. Indeed, in our monastery in Italy, because we were facing the east on a weekday, we were facing the cross, and the cross was an old medieval cross, and it was a miraculous cross. And one time, way back in the years between the two wars, the state wanted to take this cross away and put it in a museum. And the cross started to misbehave. As long as it was in the care of the state, there were earthquakes and earth tremors all around the monastery between there and where it was in Montalcino. And we have it on record, we have it in the archives. And eventually, because these were quite serious, they had to bring the cross back and the earth tremors ceased. And it is there to this day. And we would celebrate before that, seeing that that's how God wanted to be honoured. He wanted the best, and he liked to be faced with all his majesty. It was Christ dormant in death, having conquered, and we faced him there at the high altar, aware that we were meeting our God and not looking each other in the eyes. It was quite different. We were Mr. Gods, bringing the people of God into a cloud of glory, and the human did not enter into it. That serenity of which I mentioned at the beginning from the prior, we were entering serene mode. The angels were met and not man. It is the doors that admit us to this mysterious place. Lay aside, they say, all that cramps and narrows, all that sinks the mind. Open your heart, lift up your eyes, let your soul be free, for this is God's temple. And then it quotes the psalm, lift up your heads, O ye gates. Heed the cry of the doors. Of small use to you is a house of wood and stone, unless you yourself are God's living dwelling. By the way, Dulique, where I live, is supposed to be, whether it's true or not I don't know, but there's something in the tradition, it is the first church in stone built in this area, perhaps in Ireland itself, because the word would imply something of that nature, stone, whereas they were building churches very cheaply compared with that until they started putting them in stone. But these churches were built with the best that man had, and both in east and west they realized that when we're handling God, one gives only the best. Indeed, in our monastery in Italy, the stones in the sanctuary side of the church were all precious stones, and quite a lot of them were actually translucent. You could put a torch to them, and the light would come through. Indeed, earlier on, until not that long ago actually, the windows themselves were alabaster and not glass, and it created a magic light inside the church. So they only gave the best to God. Of small use to you, then, is a house of wood and stone, unless you yourself are God's living dwelling. The high arched gates may be lifted up, and the portals parted wide, but unless the doors of your heart are open, how can the King of Glory enter in? And so, I'll conclude there, because it's important that we realize that when we come into the house of God, what we are doing actually is finding space where we can let God enter into the doors of our own heart. And if those doors are jammed, and if those doors are holding only noise and clutter, there's little chance the Lord of Glory, who is a God of serenity and peace, will ever get a word in edgeways.